Hello, everybody. On behalf of the EAI, I would like to welcome you to this seminar. And this talk will be on philosophical, epistemological theme. The num n equals to one problem in astrobiology, which will be given by Philipp Spillmann, who is a graduate student at Cambridge University. And he was actually supposed to give this talk also at the um, BCOM meeting, but unfortunately could not attend, as I recall it. So it is nice that we have the possibility to hear your talk now. So Philipp, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much for the invitation. And well, let's get started. I will tell you something about the n=1 problem in astrobiology, which is the topic of my PhD thesis. So I'm giving you a little bit of an overview and some thoughts to take away. So the question that we're going to look at roughly is, how can you do science on aliens without aliens? So here's an outline of what we're going to do today. So first of all, I am giving you some thoughts to begin with. Then we have a closer look at the n=1 problem as a thing in its own right. We are briefly going to look at arguments that take the n=1 problem to arrive at some sort of pessimistic negative conclusion about what we cannot do in astrobiology. I will discuss these arguments, and I will outline a road to optimism, basically by outlining that it's much more complicated than it might seem. And finally, there are some traps to avoid that we will address. Okay, let's get started. So where we are, astrobiology, often defined as the study of the origins, evolution, distribution, and future of life in the universe. That's the NASA definition. I'm sure you all know this. And here's some conflict. So Thomas Ray says, ideally, the science of astrobiology should embrace all forms of life. However, in practice, it has been restricted to the study of a single instance of life, life on Earth. Because biology is based on a sample size of 1, we cannot know what features of life are peculiar to Earth and what features are general, characteristic of all life. So there seems to be some tension. On the one hand, between the ambition to provide insightful scientific knowledge about life in the universe, so tell us something that we don't know yet, and the fact that we are, in doing so, are limited to life on Earth alone. There's a bit more detail to consider. So what does it mean, insightful? That's sort of a vague word. So on the one hand, we want to find out things in astrobiology about life on Earth that biology, to put it simply, cannot tell us already. On the other hand, we actually want to find out stuff that is genuine about alien life, forms of life that we have not encountered, or maybe we cannot yet fully comprehend. So what does it mean that we're limited to life on Earth alone? Well, on the one hand, this is a statement, or we can't take this as a statement about our observations. So we only have empirical access to biological sources, so organisms, their properties, ecosystems, and so forth, that happen to be located on Earth, that have historically evolved on Earth, share a last universal common ancestor, and have the same fundamental biochemistry. On the other hand, it's also a statement about our knowledge, right? So our best biological models and theories have been developed to explain the phenomena we observe on Earth, and they have been tested only by organisms and phenomena that are produced historically on Earth. So, however, what I want to say, or what I want to kind of convey in this talk, is that it's not immediately evident where this tension comes from. So what exactly the threat is, what the stakes are, how the threat is best explained, and how worrisome we should take the threat to be. So if unsolved, how troubling is it that we're only limited to a single instance of life on Earth? Yeah. Okay. So let's zoom in. This is the conflict that as I laid it out above. And so here in the highlighted sentences, you see more specifically what people have called the n=1 problem. So again, because life on Earth is just a single sample, we cannot know what features of life are peculiar to Earth and what features are general. A lot of people have brought this up in one way or another. So since basically the advent of astrobiology in the late 60s.
Designing the smart systems and smart systems.
Okay. So here's Gigi Simpson, a biologist that has been notoriously critical of astrobiology. So he says we have only a single example on which to base such judgment. So he's talking about predictions about where to find alien life, possibly. So the problem of extrapolating from this unique example is to decide whether it is inevitable, probable, improbable, or impossible for life of independent origin to have followed a similar or identical course. We have Carl Sagan, who says, in our present profound ignorance of exobiology, life is a solipsism. There is no aspect of contemporary biology in which we can distinguish the evolutionary accident from the biological sine qua non. We cannot distinguish the contingent from the necessary. And we have Carol Cleland, who has basically written most of all the aforementioned people about this problem and has really provided groundbreaking insights into analyzing this problem. So she says, generalizing on the basis of a sample of one is always risky unless one has good reasons for believing that the sample is representative. There are compelling empirical and theoretical reasons, however, for suspecting that familiar life on Earth is not representative. As discussed below, given the current state of our knowledge, it is very difficult to constrain the possibilities. So how to make sense of all this? So what to do with this? So we can look at this problem from the perspective of an outsider. So we have a conflict between roughly two things that could explain why we should be worried. So the problem could lie in the aims of astrobiological research. So that with aims, I mean stuff like answering fundamental questions about life, providing general theories, or explaining historical processes. The conflict could also be grounded, in part at least, in the norms that we, want astrobiology to fulfill. So norms that could be empirical adequacy, reliable evidence and inference, precision, accuracy, simplicity, and so forth. And finally, the available epistemic resources. So background theories we use to make inferences, methods of data production, observational equipment, etc. So if we take the outsider perspective, we ask, considering that we're limited to life on Earth alone, do we have good reasons to believe that the resources we have available suffice to meet the aims of astrobiological study without violating established norms to scientific inquiry? So how to reply to this? So roughly speaking, there are three basic answers that have been given or we could give. So we could take a skeptical, a pessimistic, or an optimistic stance. So the skeptic will just state that it's outright impossible to meet ends with the resources given. A pessimistic view is more moderate. So if you're a pessimist, you say, no, of course it's possible. It's science after all. However, it's unlikely to meet ends with the resources given. And an optimistic view states that it's not unlikely. So in order to be an optimist, you don't need to say, well, we are very lucky. You just need to say, well, we have good reasons to believe that we're not extremely unlucky. So how does this work with regard to the n=1 problem? We can think of pessimism that is motivated from the n=1 problem as an argument that leads us from four basic premises to a pessimistic conclusion about astrobiology as a science. So the first premise simply is we're limited to life only on Earth. The second is life on Earth is a single example of some sort. Based on a single example of life, we cannot establish X, whereas X is some sort of inference or a hypothesis or something else we want to do in astrobiology. Then you say we can only successfully meet a given goal that we pursue in astrobiology if we can establish that thing X. And so from all this, it follows, well, we cannot meet that goal in astrobiology. So if we take an outsider perspective, we ask basically, can pessimism be established, or is there considerable room for optimism? And so there's some sound here. How optimistic can we be? Let's take a look at this. Pessimism versus optimism. Let's take a little step back. So in order to establish scientific pessimism in general, we must establish positive reasons for thinking that some research goal will unlikely be attained successfully with the means available by following established norms. What are positive reasons? So it's basically evidence that can be empirical or theoretical that supports our pessimistic prediction. So what we're doing if we launch a pessimistic argument, we basically make a prediction. We say like, well, given all things considered, we don't think it's likely that this goal can be met in the foreseeable future. Right now, 20 years, whatever. So the mere possibility of failure is not enough to establish pessimism. So that's the main difference to a skeptical argument, where you would say it's just not enough to show that, you know, it could be that almost everything about life on Earth is super misleading. We would actually have to give positive reasons to think that we're rather misled than not misled if you're a pessimist. I would think like optimism should be our general default for science. So science is in the business of unknowns. It's sort of the premise to commit to the idea that there are things that we don't know and things we probably have wrong and we want to learn. That's why we do more research. So it should be our general default for science unless or until we can establish that failure is more reasonable to expect than success, all things considered. So in light of all the knowledge and evidence we have. So how to possibly establish pessimism in light of the n = 1 problem? So we can actually make this argument a bit more complicated and divide it in 2 steps. So on the one hand, someone might just be happy to say that there's a certain type of belief that we cannot justify. We cannot establish X. And then someone might want to say much more and want to say like, no, because we cannot establish these sorts of beliefs, like certain long-term goals or so in astrobiology cannot be established. So this gives us, for an optimist, there are 3 kind of points of attack. So you can attack the claim that life on Earth is really a single example of life, or what that means, whether it's a single example in the relevant way, in the sense relevant for the kind of inferences, like the kind of X that we're concerned with. You can attack that we cannot establish X based on a single example of life on Earth alone. For example, you can argue there's additional evidence that can be brought to support X. And finally, you can try to establish that a given goal can be established even if, you know, X is not safely supported. So where does the concern from a single example of life come in? So basically, there are 2 ideas. One idea is to say that, well, we explain why is life a single example simply because it shares a common origin. So all life on Earth has a last universal common ancestor. And secondly, because life is a single example, we cannot determine whether its observable characteristics are representative or unrepresentative of life outside of Earth. The idea is basically one of underdetermination. So Sebastian von Herner has pronounced this quite clearly. What's roughly the idea? So regarding the origin and evolution of life, he writes, our own case is at present the only instance we know of. Are we permitted to generalize this single case? Can we do statistics with an n of 1? The laws of statistics say that an n of 1 yields an estimate for the average, but none of them for the mean error, which would need at least an n of 2. This means that assuming us to be average has the highest probability of being right, but we do not have any indication of how wrong this might be. So what he points out here, what this passage really brings brings out well is that the way people have thought of the n=1 problem, or like what's really at the heart of the problem, is we're not just worried about uncertainty about what we know. We're worried about uncertainty about the uncertainty of our knowledge. So it's not just that our knowledge might be limited, but our ability to determine how limited it is what's at stake. So this can be summed up simply. So due to the common origins of life on Earth, it is an N of 1. Because of that, it's underdetermined how representative of life elsewhere life on Earth is. But so what? So this concern alone does not give us positive reasons for thinking that the relevant aspects we want to extrapolate are very unrepresentative. So it does not give us reasons to believe that, we are very far away from the mean. This concern alone does not warrant general pessimism, because it doesn't give us positive reasons to be concerned that we are more likely than not at the statistic outside of the statistical norm in whatever things we care about. So this concern by itself does not necessarily tell us what kinds of inferences or hypotheses are particularly prone to being unrepresentative. It's just too unspecific of a concern. So what positive reasons are there? So this is really the main difference of the way Carol Cleland has thought about it. So she's not the only person who spells it out so clearly, but clearer than others. So the idea is roughly what we can call the argument from frozen accidents. So the idea is to say there is evidence that suggests that at least some of the molecular building blocks of modern Earth life are the contingent outcome of a historical accident. So those things, those properties that all life shares, not even those, we can assume are most representative. So with a different molecular makeup, life will be unpredictably different. And it's unlikely that the same accident occurs frequently on other planets. So this is the main idea. So I think the argument is a bit rushed. So first of all, the available scientific evidence is not that conclusive and does not concern all of life's molecular building blocks. More research is needed. So, for example, there is research that suggests that many aspects of the genetic codes are more likely not adaptations, but just drift, the outcomes of drift. But the research on, generally speaking, on the broad set of features that we might identify as the fundamental building blocks of life is much less clear on that. So the point is more research is needed. The point is not that it's not true. Secondly, astrobiologists might not have to extrapolate from Earth's entire molecular basis. There are also facts and phenomena relevant to astrobiological generalization that do not at all concern life's molecular basis. So the argument is somewhat limited. It's not clear to what the argument really applies. And then contingency on Earth does not fully inform us about contingency elsewhere. The mere fact of an accident does not tell us anything specific about the relevant probabilities. So, okay, let's say everything that characterizes like life at molecular, fundamentally at the molecular level on Earth is in fact, the outcome of a historical accident. There could have been many other ways of building life on Earth. Well, that does not tell us what happens on other planets. It gives us some sense of not being super sure that all life has to be like life on Earth, but it doesn't tell us anything relevant about the probabilities that we have to consider. So back to square one, well, clearly not. So first of all, the argument's not invalid. It's just not as strong as some pessimists may call for. There are clearly many potential ways in which life on Earth could be unrepresentative of alien life. However, it's not as straightforward of a problem as it may seem. So there are clearly many potential ways in which life on Earth could be unrepresentative. However, this is not as straightforward. What do I mean? So on the one hand, there are many ways in which life on Earth could be untypical for alien life altogether. So biology on Earth can also misrepresent alien life more or less, etc. So there are many ways to interpret this misrepresentation idea. It's not quite clear what we really have in mind or what we should have in mind. And then on the other hand, well, astrobiological research is not exposed to all potential misconceptions of life equally. So different parts of astrobiology might suffer from might be vulnerable to different sorts of ways to be untypical for life elsewhere. So let's zoom out. So the tension between the ambition to provide insightful scientific knowledge about life in the universe and the fact that we're thereby limited to life on Earth is not trivial. What do I mean? So on the one hand, it's not necessarily clear in what sense astrobiology has to provide insights about life on Earth in order to be insightful. So what is insightful really? It's not necessarily clear, on the other hand, in what sense astrobiological research is limited to life on Earth. Let's take this apart. So let's start with the insightful part. So what I said before is like the idea is roughly to tell us something about life on Earth that we don't already know, or that, you know, exceeds somewhat the scope of biology. So we can think of this as ambition as something that concerns the field as a whole in the long term, as well as something that can be split up in more reasonable portions as a road to get to these ultimate goals. Consider NASA's Big Three. So how does life begin and evolve? Does life exist elsewhere in the universe? And what's the future of life on Earth and beyond? Let's focus on the first question. So how does life begin and evolve? So we could understand this question simply as a question about the particular causal history that led to modern life on Earth. We could also zoom out a bit and understand it as a question about the more specific type of life, for example, carbon-based biochemistry on terrestrial planets in the habitable zone of an M-dwarf star. And finally, we can, of course, also understand this question as a question about any kind of life that's possible in accordance with the laws of physics and chemistry. So in some sense, it might seem that the road to this comes from here. There are good reasons to think that it's more complicated, or that's actually not as linear as one might suggest. So we cannot sufficiently account for the causal history that led to modern life on Earth by merely studying life on Earth, so ancient or modern life. So why not? So we know that ancient life was considerably different from modern Earth ancient Earth, sorry, was considerably different from modern Earth in terms of its chemistry. And we also know that the way modern life produces its biomolecules cannot have been available to, you know, in a prebiotic environment. The molecular and genetic evidence from modern organisms cannot tell us what prebiotic chemistry must have looked like. And so, on the other hand, as we know, most sediments from the earliest stages of life are just lost due to erosion and plate tectonics. So how do we get access to, you know, very, very, very ancient forms of life or prebiotic chemistry? Finally, many precursors of organic chemistry will also have formed outside of Earth. So our best chances to understand our own origins is to look both inwards and outwards. So find more general, albeit not necessarily universal models, processes and pathways that account for geochemical and biochemical evolution, as well as their interplay. And to study rocks from outer space, the formation of other star systems, the geochemistry of other planets, the atmosphere of young exoplanets, etc., etc. So the idea that, you know, we could just explain the origins of life without having to also explain on Earth, without also having to explain the origins of life more generally, is somewhat misguided. So of course, studying then the origins of life on Earth will provide us not just with insights about life on Earth, but some types of alien life as well. Organic chemistry might not be the only type of biochemistry, but it's safe to assume that it can not only occur on Earth. and organic chemistry is compatible with many physically possible forms of biochemical systems. So what does that tell us about the insightfulness? Well, research that aims to improve our current understanding of life on Earth can provide insights about alien life. And on the other hand, improving our current understanding of life on Earth does not entail to only study modern life. So let's move to the second point, relying upon life on Earth. Let's consider an example of clearly outward-looking astrobiological research, the search for atmospheric oxygen. So roughly the idea is to search for evidence of, that's not the only idea, but one idea to search for evidence of photosynthesis. Ideally speaking, this would be confirmed if we would find things like fluxes of atmospheric oxygen that seems surprising, given the potential things that might remove the oxygen or should be removing oxygen from the atmosphere. The absence of abiotic explanations for these fluxes, additional effects that could corroborate a biogenic origin thesis, like ozone or the vegetational red edge or something like that. The right contextual conditions to make the existence of oxygenic photosynthesis plausible. So there are multiple ways and degrees to which this approach is limited to the search for Earth-like life. So, for example, contextually, we usually narrow our search to terrestrial planets in the habitable zone. But in what sense is that Earth-like? It's not very narrowly Earth-like. Venus and Mars, as we know, are also terrestrial planets in the habitable zone. We search for organic biochemistry, but then again, that's compatible with life that could be very different from life on Earth, just based also on carbon. There's a bias, on the other hand, like towards modern life on Earth, since it's very recent that oxygen became available in high concentrations in the atmosphere. There's also the idea of searching for phototropic metabolism or the search for redox chemistry. So all these things, in many different ways, characterize what we mean by life on Earth or what we're searching for. Some of these things are more narrowly biased towards modern life on Earth, and some of these things are much more broad. So it's really hard to say that there's just a single way of being limited to Earth-like life, or what Earth-likeness even is supposed to amount to. At least two perspectives I think are relevant to consider here. So empirically, of course, the origins of photosynthesis is contingent upon earlier innovations, pathways, and events. However, theoretically, we can reason about photosynthesis in non-contingent physical and chemical terms, in terms of metabolism, ecological relationships, and so forth. So the main point is, just because something is historical, it doesn't mean that it's automatically strongly biased towards our own particular history, environment, or chemistry. And on the other hand, biological facts and phenomena are not the only types of phenomena that could be biased or respectively that are historical. So let's take some stock. So it's reasonable to make use of the evidence that we have while keeping our claims modest. All else equal, it's rational to assume that as observers of life in the universe, we're not in all relevant ways extremely untypical all the time. So I would call this cautious optimism. We don't have reasons to believe that we live in a worst case world. It's worthy to more extensively promote scientific pluralism and diversity of astrobiological research. It's furthermore important to promote research dedicated to better understand our own limitations. So this roots back to the idea of uncertainty about our uncertainty. So what other potential sources of biases could there be that might be messing with our observations and our knowledge of life? And finally, we should attempt to improve our understanding of the n equals 1 problem by providing a much more fine-grained picture. So instead of mostly thinking of, is it a problem for astrobiology in general, we should try to understand what are the specific limitations to the specific assumptions in different parts of astrobiological research. What are potential biases there? And how does this play out in practice? Some traps to avoid on the way there. So I think there are at least 3 different basic traps that we should avoid: unreasonable standards, unrealistic or uninteresting aims, or irrelevant limiting factors. What I mean with traps is like simplified ways to come up with optimistic or pessimistic arguments. So unreasonably high standards. Here's another quote from the same paper from G.G. Simpson. So in this paper, he basically tries to argue that it's not worth to pursue exobiology back then, astrobiology in the 1960s, simply because it's just extremely improbable to ever find alien life. And without alien life, like what evidence do we have to, you know, do astrobiological research? So it roots back to this question, like how to do science on aliens without aliens. So he writes, there's even increasing recognition of a new science of extraterrestrial life, sometimes called exobiology, a curious development in the view of the facts that this science has yet to demonstrate that its subject matter exists. So what are the unreasonably high standards here? Like, one critical assumption is that the sources of data must be identical with the targets of inquiry. So you can only make reasonable claims about aliens on the basis of aliens. That would disqualify many model organisms. So we study the human brain by studying rat brains and so forth. It would also disqualify simulations as sources of data, and it would render many fields of research unscientific. So a second trap, uninteresting aims. So popular objection to this sort of like missing subject argument is given in a passage like this. So Milan Cirkovic, he writes, astrobiology is often criticized by the claim that it is so far an inquiry without a subject, considering that we have no evidence whatsoever of any kind of extraterrestrial life, intelligent or not. False. The subject of astrobiology is a cosmic life, not just extraterrestrial life. Well, that's true, and that was really his entire point. But it would be an uninteresting claim to make in order to, you know, defend against pessimism, simply because, yeah, well, extraterrestrial life is still crucially important in astrobiology. Unrealistic aims. So Carol Cleland writes in another paper, one cannot safely generalize to all life, wherever and whenever it may be found, from a single potentially unrepresentative example of life. As a consequence, scientists and philosophers are currently in no position to formulate even a tentative general theory of life. It's a bold claim, but let's grant it. Still, how important is it in astrobiology to formulate a general theory of life? Not all research is concerned with all life or with life as such. Finally, irrelevant limiting factors. So Carlos Mariscal, he writes, it is possible to know anything about life. Is it possible to know anything about life we have not yet encountered? We know of only one example of life, our own. Given this, many scientists are inclined to doubt that any principles of Earth biology will generalize to other worlds in which life might exist. Let's call this the n=1 problem. By comparison, we expect the principles of geometry, mechanics, and chemistry would generalize. Right, that's true. However, not every generalization problem will be relevant to consider for us in astrobiology. So some biological truth will fail to generalize to other worlds simply because so many biological truths are non-universal and historically contingent. But this will remain a problem no matter how many examples of life we have available to us. So this is a relevant problem in astrobiology, but it's distinct from the n=1 problem. So we should become clear on what are the specific issues that arise simply because we have only one instance, whatever that means, of life available to us. On the other hand, some astrobiological generalizations can currently not be supported simply because it would take a very, very large sample of inhabited worlds to adequately support them. So think of a general theory of life. I mean, how many samples of life do you need in order to say like, well, this is now the general theory to represent all life that would ever exist in the entire universe? Probably a lot. So in such cases, it does not matter all that much that our available current sample consists only of an n of 1, because even an n of many would likely be insufficient. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philip, for this very interesting presentation about the problems and pitfalls in astrobiology and in the search for extraterrestrial life. The talk is now open for discussion contributions and questions. You can do two things. Either you just raise your hand and ask a question, or you can also ask the question via the chat if you prefer that. So both is fine. And I invite now contributions and questions. Giuseppe, please, and then Michele.
Okay, thanks for the seminar. That was extremely interesting. I mean, all these objections and many of our reaction to these objections are a bit biased in the sense that there are, in my opinion, there are physical attributes of life that can be generalized. For instance, for sure, life requires chemical disequilibrium. For sure, life requires a local decrease of entropy. And both of these things are not, as far as we know, or better, as far as I know, are not possible, especially are difficult to produce without a biochemical mechanism of some way or some sort. So could not generalize this very simple thing. I mean, a local decrease of entropy and a local disequilibrium. Of course, you have to verify that there are no known processes that can produce such things, but this is a very basic thing that all life is expected to do, isn't it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And to my knowledge, that's not something that anyone seriously contests. So I would say there are two issues here. So, or like the main issue is that, I mean, right, so how informative can physical and chemical theory be in determining what sort of biology we should expect or not on other planets, or what sort of biological properties will eventually evolve in different environments throughout the universe. So the idea that you mentioned is relevant, for example, in the search for biosignatures, where a lot of people search for evidence of redox disequilibrium in the atmosphere of exoplanets. However, that doesn't tell us like what are the substances, the chemical things in the atmosphere that will, necessarily, tell us about such a disequilibrium. That's a very non-trivial question that a lot of research flows in, and it is tied, for example, in the example of oxygen, to assumptions about the kind of metabolism that will evolve, right? Such as photosynthesis, phototrophy, mechanisms of getting energy from photons to produce biomass. So you're absolutely right. The physics just don't bring us very far. Usually that's one of the main sources of having to worry about the biology. Does that make sense?
Yes, I thank you. I just think that we should pay an extreme attention to all kinds of disequilibria or negentropy that we will find around, because life can be very different, but these are needed.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, then Michaela, please. Michaela? You are muted,
Sorry,
Michaela.
I forgot. I
Yeah.
forgot to put on the microphone. My problem is if it is possible to make a parallel of the one equal one problem for life, for astrobiology, with the similar problem in cosmology, that we have just one universe, and taking inspiration on the way in which this problem has been managed by cosmologists. Do you think this is meaningful?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and of course, I don't know too much about the ways cosmologists have reasoned about this in terms of multiverses and so forth. I know some stuff about fine-tuning arguments, and effectively there are some fine-tuning considerations that flow into certain pessimistic arguments, like the argument from frozen accidents. So the idea really there is to ask, like, why is it that all life on Earth is based only, for example, on DNA or only on carbon? It's a similar question to why are all the fine-tuned parameters in the universe have just that value rather than some other. So there's similarities there. I'm very sure there's fruitful synergies that we could make about exploring this from the perspective of cosmology further. I mean, in the end, well, there's a genuine cosmological dimension of astrobiology. It's like it happens in the cosmos, right? Life. Is that satisfying? It's a really nice. I think you're right. It's a really nice input.
Thank you.
Yes, then Luis, please.
Excuse me?
Luis on the
Yes.
call.
Yes, hello. I found your talk very discouraging, actually, because you are, in fact, you are trapped in more or less the idea that n is one because we only know our life, and for me it's okay. But what do we do for that? As a scientist, I mean, what shall I do for getting away of this n equals one? It seems to me that it's going to be very impractical and very, very, very difficult to find what people call biosignatures on exoplanets for many, many reasons, because you will never know if a biosignature is really related to some kind of life that you don't know. So I would think that the best way to get out of this problem of n is equal to 1 is that you should try to get to n is equal to 2, which then will give you the possibility to have a much larger number of n. So I would advocate the idea that you should really, we should, the astrobiological community should focus on trying to find some life on Mars, because Mars is the only planet where you can go, even if it is still difficult. You don't mistake me, but it's the only place where we can go, where we can pick up samples, we can bring in the samples in our labs and do everything on them, and eventually find something, maybe not strictly living, but maybe fossils, for example. And this is a prospect which can be achieved in what, if I am Frances will tell me, but maybe 20 years or 25 years or 30 years. And this is very exciting and change a little bit the perspective of n is equal to 1, because maybe n is equal to 2.
Amazing, thank you. I hope I have not been. I would advocate, like I would completely agree with you, and or like mostly agree with you. And I've tried to advocate cautious optimism. I think there's 2 points that I would like to pick from what you said. So the one point is that I think it's a serious problem. The many uncertainties that we face when it comes to biosignature research is not necessarily due to our limitation to a sample of 1 or so. It's just there's so many uncertainties from these exoplanet environments, from what really happens there, because the data is so limited and the theoretical possibilities are so vast that you will always find a reason to be doubtful or to be assertive. So this is a very non-trivial problem that is, I think, very serious, but unfortunately not directly linked to the n=1 problem. Or fortunately, maybe. In terms of finding life elsewhere, yeah, that's basically what everyone has in mind that I quoted above, or nearly apart from G.G. Simpson, everyone. So Carl Sagan, for example, pointed out the concerns with, you know, the limitations to biology because of the limitation to a single instance of life as a reason to motivate exobiology back then, like astrobiology today. So my personal stance is that I think we should be cautious about being too narrow in what we search for, but many of the criteria we search for are not extremely narrowly centered around modern life. And if we were to find, for example, evidence of organic chemistry on other planets, and that would be a true positive, and we were to more closely inspect that and find out more, chances are that that form of life is at least in some sense different from us, not entirely, but we would likely learn a lot that we don't already know. So I think there is something like bootstrapping that is possible, at least in theory. I believe it's the much more challenging question is actually, well, in terms of the facts, like how frequent is life? Like even if you find life once somewhere, if it's not very, very frequent, or if we're just too early in the universe for life to be populated, for it to be super frequently populated, we can just learn only so and so much additionally from other instances of life. But this again is not the n=1 problem. But so yeah, thanks. I agree with you. It's important to point it out.
Thank you.
Okay. Then Jan Henrik has the next question, please.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you. That was a very interesting, very inspiring talk. I think one thing that you didn't really mention, but I think which might be important, is that there are other reasons for doing science than just being able to achieve an end goal. I mean, just because we might not be able ever to really conclusively answer the question about life in the universe doesn't mean that the research isn't really interesting. Also, we might not know what else we might find while doing the science. I mean, I study prebiotic chemistry, and maybe what I do with chemistry on comets has nothing to do with life. It's very well possible, but we learn a lot about radiation damage in tissues. We learn about radiation damage in materials, and this has all kinds of implications and applications, and it is really, really interesting. I mean, I don't get up in the morning because I believe that I might answer the question of the origin of life once and for all, but because all these tiny little details are really very interesting in their own right. And maybe the n=1 problem isn't a problem because, yeah, you could do interesting science even if your ultimate goals are unrealistic. I mean, science is not about achieving the goal. It's about the way there. It's about the methods.
Great, amazing, thank you. I would mostly agree with you, like let's say 90%. So where I agree with is that yes, it's a trap, I think, to measure like to justify or motivate the existence or the way the characteristics of a field of research for a research project by its ultimate aims. Like if the ultimate aims of physics is to understand everything about why the universe exists and stuff like that, I mean, we're not going to happen, or unlikely, and we should not, you know, evaluate physics by promises like that. These are sort of like factors in a sense that are fruitful. On the other hand, I mean, astrobiology is really expensive, and I think there is some important point to who pays for it and how this research is motivated and justified, but what sort of promises. It's a non-trivial question of what you should consider a realistic goal for present day and near future research should be. I am personally not advocating for something in particular, and I'm completely on board with you in that I think there's more than enough we can learn from just studying other star systems or trying to understand how we can find life. There's more than enough interesting and valuable things we can learn without having to ever, you know, like wonder what are the answer all these big three or so questions. Yeah, sorry that I didn't convey that point clear enough. You're absolutely right on that. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Alexander, please.
Thank you. So it seems that the problem of the concept of life is wider than the so-called biological life. So, for example, if we take into account the possibility or the experiments with the artificial life, soft and hard artificial life, is this in any way relevant to the problem for astrobiology and specifically the n=1 problem? And in which way? Thank you.
Very good, very good. Thanks. This is a great question. So Thomas Ray, who I initially quoted, let me go back. He came up with the n=1 problem in contrast to Sagan, not to motivate astrobiological research, but in order to motivate, or where is it? Like basically more research into artificial life. So that's him. I don't have a strong stance on this personally. Carol Cleland, for example, she gives, I think, more or less convincing reasons to think that what we can learn for astrobiology by studying artificial life might have its limits. What these limits are, I'm not sure. But her reasoning is roughly that, well, whatever we come up with in terms of like computer simulations or so forth, like this is already based on assumptions about life as we know it. So there will always be, no matter what we can learn, it will always be some sort of a bias. This is a simplified version of the argument. I don't recall all the details, but so the question I think in general is like, hey, okay, the universe has a history, and depending on what kind of environments will originate where and what kind of chemistry will be there, different forms of life, if they're possible, will evolve depending on these historical facts. So by studying like possibilities of, you know, what life could be in the lab, we can learn a lot about what could possibly evolve somewhere. Determining what will evolve is a different story. So that's, for example, one way in which there might be its limits, but I certainly think there are insights. I mean, it depends on what exactly you mean with artificial biology, and we would have to talk much more about that in details. I don't think there's a general answer to this question, but I do think the question is relevant and reasonable. But again, I'm not an astrobiologist, so you might want to ask an actual astrobiologist about that. I know this is not the most satisfying answer. I hope it makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Well, I was more focused on possibly the philosophical aspects. For example, do we need to strive for a single concept, for a unified concept of life, or for a plurality of concepts? And when is astrobiology employing one concept of life, and for example, then some intelligent robots that we can construct on Earth are irrelevant for astrobiology, or possibly there are some other venues? Well, yes, but I don't know. Yeah. So
I think it depends
Possibly.
what
Yeah.
what kind of researcher you ask.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, then there is a question via the chat from Eric Passion. That is if we find, so sorry, I have to start from the beginning, of course, apologies for that. The n is equal to one problem is due to the fact that all life on Earth is related, but is there also another n is one problem in that there is only one species on Earth that is thinking about life. That is, if we find another species, another world that is thinking about life, will the fact that they think about life in a different way make a bigger impact on our attempts to understand life than the fact that their biology is different? That's a bit of a complicated question.
I love this question. Thanks. I'm going to talk more about this, in more detail in the upcoming Kavli conference in Durham. But so I think you're pointing in the right direction. So something that has rarely been done in the literature that explicitly addresses the n equals 1 problem, at least the literature that I could find. Almost nobody challenges this claim of, life on Earth as an n equals 1, because it's just so intuitively plausible that, yeah, of course there's a common origin, aka, so there's like sort of a single history, single clade or something like that. However, if you dig more into more detail, it's a bit more complicated when it comes to this sort of inferences that we want to make about alien life, because, for example, we also want to make inferences about different kinds of environments, or we want to make inferences about different kinds of biochemistry. So the kind of life that we would have to, so it's not just a quantitative problem, it's a qualitative problem as well. So Carol Cleland points this out sometimes, and she writes, yeah, so she says what we should really find is not just some naturally occurring alien life, but really some sort of a genuinely novel kind of life. So depending on how you theorize about, like, how you explain this sort of claim, or how you make sense of the claim that life on Earth is a single example, whether that's because it's on a planet, and a single planet, or in a single type of solar system, of a star system, a single type of biochemistry and whatnot, you will come to very different conclusions about what constitutes a genuine second example, and a third example, and a fourth example, and so forth. So I don't think there's when it comes to the question of how should we sample independently occurring instances of life, I don't think it's very trivial. So to come back to the initial question with life in the lab, that life would presumably be very similar biochemically speaking. It might be, if we create it by fusing on the basis of like material, genetic or other cellular material that that was produced biogenically. It depends on really what you mean artificial life, right? But like a synthetic life form. So there's a lot of, it's a very, we get very quickly in the like metaphysical details that I don't want to get into right now, but I'd be super happy to talk with you this further, because I don't think there's that much written about it, and it's a super cool question that deserves more attention. Yeah, okay. It was not the clearest answer, but I hope it's halfway satisfying.
Okay. There is another question actually by Eric, which I missed first, which sounds, if we manage to create life from scratch in the lab, would that make n equal 2 as n equal 1 because the created life will be modeled on present Earth?
Sorry, I kind of I saw the message and I kind of answered the second question, I think.
I think yes. I think, okay, sorry about that.
Although I should both like quickly check again.
Okay.
So the lab question, that's the first question, and then the fact that life on Earth is related, but there's another n equals 1 problem in that there is only one species on Earth, and the thing is to find another species.
Okay.
Yeah, Eric, if you want me to answer the other question, please let me know. But otherwise, how about we just move to someone else?
Yeah, that is a talk by a question by Nasser Masrani.
Yeah, hey, so since we often talk about how life on exoplanets or outside would be unrecognizable, would you consider that there could be life on Earth that is indistinguishable to us by our senses or instruments, or even global?
Do you mean some sort of shadow biosphere?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that's a thing I've been contemplating earlier. It came to mind.
So I think that the question has two parts.
And
oh, sorry, yeah.
And I mean, like to support it, there is maybe yeah, I don't feel like elaborating much on it, but I feel like there are some signs that could push towards a direction to consider that.
Cool. So I think there's two questions that we can analyze this in terms of questions. One is that, so do we have like just out of the bat good reasons to believe that, you know, there could be some sort of alternative biosphere that independently originated like recently or recent enough so that there's still descendants of that origin event present on Earth. And secondly, if that biosphere was really considerably different biochemically from what we think of as modern life on Earth, could be detected with our instruments. So the second question is a bit harder to ask because it basically, I mean, you right. So there's always the possibility. So the way we devise our experiments is really implicitly based on finding like proteins and stuff like that we know. I don't know too much about the details, but Carol Klin has written a really interesting paper about it where she argues that our instruments are observational and experimental instruments are heavily biased towards modern life on Earth. So she would, I'm sure, think that, yeah, we could unlikely detect some sort of truly different form of life on Earth. So there's a good possibility. I think in terms of the other question, whether we have just good reasons to believe that there is a shadow biosphere, I think the facts just restrict how this could be the place, how this could have taken place. We live in a very deadly environment due to the high oxygen for many sort of like ways to produce life. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, to be honest. Like I can't fully answer this question to a satisfying degree, I think, but I'm sure researchers here in the audience might.
Yeah, all good.
Okay. There is another question by Angelika Kovacevic in the chat. And it sounds, is there a possibility that shifts from fourth to the fifth paradigm in data science and computing could help biochemistry space-based exploration. I am not sure if I understand the question, but maybe it's good that you read it on the chat list.
Firstly, I don't know what the shift to the fourth or the fifth paradigm means.
Maybe Angelica can explain that if she's still here.
Yes, hello. Thanks so much for amazing talk and putting so much efforts to encourage astrobiologists to proceed further. And I am thinking about, we are now in the fourth paradigm, which is actually related to using enormous high-performing computing centers for data, for finding some correlation within the data. However, the fifth paradigm will be more, more different and exploring, for example, spatial computing like Apple Vision Pro headset, which appeared this January, or Neuralink, for example. So actually combination between the artificial intelligence and maybe real intelligence, but that is, technologically far away maybe. But in order to explore, as I could understand your talk, you are encouraging also modeling and extrapolation of the models and everything. So just, do we need maybe new type, this fifth paradigm, in order to be more, effective in exploration of the models, of the all possible biochemistry landscapes, and then building technology which can actually find the biosignatures? I hope that I am not too complicated with this question. Thank you.
Thank you. I love this question. And unfortunately, I'm really not qualified to answer it, because I just don't know enough about these technologies and these modeling techniques and everything. From the top of my head, I would think, why not? Better computational abilities and methods will certainly help to get a better, more fine-grained picture, for example, of what happens on exoplanet atmospheres, given that the data permits that, right? Yeah, I'm sorry not to be able to give a better, more detailed answer here.
No, thank you so much. It is amazing. Thank you.
Okay, that is another, then probably the last question we can allow or comment by, it's a little bit more a comment actually by Roberto Arechaga, which is, in my opinion, by the moment the astrobiology is a scientific exploration based on the terrestrial life model, and it will truly become science when it finds its own subject, extraterrestrial life. By the moment its subject is terrestrial life, if astrobiology wants to be called science.
Well, I strongly disagree. I'm sorry.
Me too, yeah.
Because I think that falls under the unreasonable high standards. I mean, it's basically what Simpson had in mind. And these are my objections, the main ones. I think there are more to raise. But I think the standard is just too high the assumption is that in order to make to support justified beliefs about life in general or alien life in particular environments, so you have to basically have organisms or some sort of thing that you can study. But that's just not, I mean, then you would have to disqualify, for example, a lot of climate science. We don't know, we don't have the future climate. A lot of Earth, that deep history of the Earth, and much more. Yeah. So these were my main points. It would just disqualify a lot of other stuff that we do in science, and therefore it's certainly too much to ask Yeah, that's my answer.
Okay. Actually, I don't really see any further questions, so let's thank Philipp again for agreeing to talk at this seminar. And the next seminar will be, as usual, again on the 19th of March, so in just 2 weeks. And I hope that you can see that I can see you there then. And last thanks to our speaker, and have a good evening.